Okay, today is a really significant day, being the 11th anniversary of the World Suicide Prevention Day, but is it just me? Do other people find that name quite hard-cased? Does it mean that today that suicide will be prevented throughout the world? That would mean that we'd save 2,700 lives. I've done the maths. Wouldn't that be good, if only? What it's really about, though, is giving us globally a chance to focus our attention on the unacceptable burden and cost of suicide on our societies. It's actually significant today for another reason too. It's also the first birthday of my youngest moko, Te Kaitiaki. And I want to mention him today because to be here speaking with you means that I can't be with him today. And like the name that he carries, that's significant for a number of reasons. When he was born this day a year ago, he was wrapped immediately in an East Coast rugby jersey and placed on his mama, my daughter, next to the pounamu that she had gripped the whole way through her labour. Just like now, the tears flowing. The rugby jersey and the pounamu were my husband's, who took his life 4 years earlier. I think my girl, who was 12 at the time, and the apple of her father's eye, mourned her dad more on that day that she became a parent than she had ever before, because not only was she again confronted with the fact that he wasn't there to share in her joy, for the first time she had to struggle to make sense of how, as a parent, he left his children. In those moments, nothing made sense to her. For those of you who know intimately that pain and torture of losing loved ones to suicide, you know what I'm talking about. That overwhelming grief that smothers you seemingly out of nowhere at every single significant life event. Even when you thought this time round that you'd be sweet, it cripples you, maybe just momentarily, maybe for a little bit longer, until you find your way out again. So today, as we collectively focus our attention on the unacceptable burden and cost of suicide, it's Te Kaitiaki and our other moko and our 5 children who are foremost in my mind. So I'm pretty sure this audience doesn't need any reminder of the enormity of this beast that we're talking about, but just to jog your memory. In the last 6 years in our country, over 3,250 people, family members, chose to die rather than live. In the last 4 years, in about August, September, we've reacted as a country with shock and horror to this fact, as the latest stats are released by Chief Coroner Judge Neil McLean. The provisional ones he released a couple of weeks ago showed that 541 people intentionally ended their lives in Aotearoa in the year ending 30 June 2013. That's 3 people in Aotearoa every 2 days, 45 a month. I'm sure most of you know that that's around twice our national road toll statistics. I also wanted to say kind of up front that I feel a little bit intimidated somewhat today, because I'm speaking amongst people for whom suicidology or the study of suicide is part of what they do. I need to be really clear that I'm talking as a mum and as a grandmother and as a cousin and as a wife at the time, and although what I have to say is based somewhat on my experience as a researcher, I don't claim to be an expert in Māori suicide. I just have a lot to say about it. And the reason I speak out about it is purely and simply because it has affected me and my whānau so profoundly. I speak from the perspective of our forced inclusion in that group called Bereaved by Suicide. And I do so because I think I have a responsibility to ensure that the voices of whānau are heard. This picture tells you why. Shows you the legacy of my whānau, that my whānau has of suicide. We're now into our 3rd generation. Our first generation's in the middle there of my auntie. That second generation in yellow is my generation. And a couple of years ago we stepped into our third generation with 2 nephews in 1 week. Don't be fooled though in thinking that this is Māori suicide. These suicides are all associated with my maternal side and my mum's Pākehā. So of those 9 suicides up there now in my whānau, 3 of them are Māori. I think what's probably more startling about that picture is that the majority of those who have taken their lives in our whānau have been non-whakapapa partners or children of partners. And all those non-whakapapa suicides have been male. I've a few ideas about why that might be, which maybe I might come back to if we've got time. But today I've been asked to speak specifically about Māori suicide. So this here is the statistical face, at least, of Māori suicide. The graph shows you the provisional suicide rates by ethnicity between July 2007 and June 2013. Māori are that tall red line. At around 19 per 100,000 people, we have the dubious honour of having the highest rate of suicide out of every ethnic group in Aotearoa, more than twice the rate of Pacific and Asian. I thought more than a third higher than other non-Māori, but I've just heard Dr Crawshaw say our rate is 5 times greater than non-Māori. The good news is that the latest provisional rates from July 2012 to June 2013 show that Māori suicides have dropped in number for the first time since records started being collected in 2007. In the last year, 105 Māori died by suicide. That's a significant drop in the spike of last year of 132 suicides. And the drop is largely attributed or accounted for by the decrease in Māori male suicides. I think that's fantastic, but it's certainly not time for celebration. The annual number of Māori suicides over the last 6 years is 104 people a year, and that's 104 people too many. So here's the number one question I guess we're all here for. How do we stop these deaths? I have a couple of untested, quite possibly unfounded theories about suicide. One of them is that we may be missing the mark in suicide prevention by failing to focus enough on post-vention. We know the biopsychosocial, environmental, social and cultural risk factors with suicide. We know, for example, that someone with depression who has a history of trauma or abuse, has a whānau history of suicide, is much more at risk of suicide than someone without a mental illness, with no history of abuse or familial suicide. We also know about the protective factors of suicide, or we know somewhat. We know, for example, that having strong connections to your whānau and community, or knowing how to problem solve or resolve conflict constructively, places you at kind of in a lower risk category. So when I was thinking about this, this is the way I think. I was thinking, if we know this, why aren't we putting more resources into ensuring the things that protect against suicide are provided to those most at risk? Suicide, to my mind, is not a decision made by a well mind or an intact wairua. So why are we not specifically providing targeted mental health and cultural support to people with previous suicide attempts and or a family history of suicide? Why aren't we asking whānau dealing with the trauma of suicide what they need to keep themselves and their whānau safe? Now I've just heard the previous speaker speak and I'm really pleased to see that those action plans and those priorities and the action plan. So maybe what I have to say is somewhat kind of answered. It looks like we at least have the ideals of where we want to go written down well. It's possible I have a distorted view of what's happening in our communities. Seems to me that what has been happening is that when we deal with suicide in our whānau, it's kind of done in a huge vacuum, a vacuum that's void of any real support or direction. So I view the effects of suicide like a stone, or actually more like a boulder, dropping into a lake. If the water is calm at the time of the impact, the ripples go on, and you can see them clearly as they spread. But if the rock or the boulder falls into already troubled waters, the effect is more like that bottom picture there. The ripples still exist, but they smash into all the other ripples and they take on new lives and cause other ripples of their own. So it takes the troubled waters much, much longer to regain calmness than the previously still ones, or than the other still ones. The bottom picture, though, I think, more reflects the way of how our whānau are currently having to deal with suicide. For a start, just due to the increased number of suicides in Māori whānau, the odds of ripples smashing into each other are increased. Then there's our higher prevalence of mental health disorders, including PTSD and depression and substance disorders. The result is often chaos. I see whānau all the time having no idea how to deal with the pain of suicide because there is already just so much going on that's tough for them. And I don't see the systematic response of support by agencies, but rather what seems to happen is that broken people just learn to limp. The other way I think that we have dealt with suicide in our whānau has been to not talk about it. In the same way we continue to sweep sexual abuse under the mat, so do we find it extremely difficult to talk about suicide. I've been to tangi in my own whānau of those who have ended their lives by suicide, and not once was there mention that that had happened. The word suicide was never said. I can't accept that that's a healthy response. There are many reasons suicide remains a hidden taboo in our whānau. There are many reasons why we don't openly talk about it. For many, there's the gripping fear attached to it that plays games with our heads. What if by speaking about it, we reawaken that beast that sleeps and it happens again? I think about that a lot. What if it follows me? Believe me, with the number of partner deaths we've had in our whānau, we have an incredible array of what-if scenarios. There's a stigma attached to suicide that makes it too hard even to say the word for some. Much of that stigma, I think, originates in religious beliefs, and I have to say I've not seen a hell of a lot of good come from it, only further inflicted pain. Still, others don't feel able to talk about suicide because of the reactions of others. Suicide is fundamentally seen by many to be a selfish act, but for those bereaved by suicide, viewing their loved ones as selfish may be an impossible task, and again, only creates more pain. So rather than having to deal with the judgment of others, it's sometimes easier just to say nothing, both if you are suicidal and if you've been bereaved by suicide. For Māori whānau, I think there's another very real reason for some not to address suicide, that being whakamā. Whakamā is often interpreted as shame, shyness or embarrassment or kind of those connotations, but it has much deeper meanings than this. For someone like my husband, whose world was totally Māori, whakamā meant for him that when he was clinically assessed by tūpaka 3 weeks before he took his life, that he told them everything that they needed to know, what he thought they needed to know. He would never have spoken with them about his visits from his tupuna, and nor should he. But these types of cultural understandings also don't fit within the Western psychiatry or psychology, so they become kind of a natural barrier to mainstream support. For those of us left behind, that whakamā remains. Maybe it's manifested in different ways, but I know I've been told by some that speaking out about suicide is just a search for sympathy, and it's not something that we do culturally. I think it's another form of whakamā. So the reasons for our silence really are quite vast. But like Judge McLean, I disagree with the silence that's encasing suicide. I cannot believe this is helping us deal with the reality. We do need to bring the issue of suicide from out of the shadows. And in my humble opinion, one simple way of doing that is to let the stories be told. These comments on this slide and the next one are made by Indigenous women friends of mine who are both suicide survivors, as in, have had attempts and have lost others to suicide. This one describes carrying the shame, the confusion, guilt and anger associated with suicide. but both of them talk about the healing process of speaking about suicide. Both acknowledge the need to speak out about it for healing to occur, to speak to it out loud without shame. Māori researchers believe the answers to Māori suicide prevention lay within ourselves as Indigenous peoples and the processes that we know culturally intrinsically to work for us. When we have anything to discuss, for example, we hui. Actually, we do that quite well. And the core function of hui, besides whanaungatanga and manaakitanga, is kōrero. I undertook some research last year with some rangatahi Māori looking at how to support whānau to support them to make good decisions around sexual and reproductive health. And one of the key findings of the research was the emphasis that rangatahi placed on communication with them by and with their whānau, kanohi to kanohi communication. A quote that came out from a young man kind of wraps it up. He said, "Doesn't matter what the conversation's about, just talk to me." That's what we need to do. We need to talk to each other about suicide and the effect it is having on us. I believe kōrero, speaking about suicide, particularly through being able to tell one's own story, plays an incredibly important role in suicide prevention, intervention and postvention. There's a transformative potential in storytelling, and it plays an essential role in healing for Indigenous peoples recovering from trauma, whether that trauma be from layers of historical or transgenerational trauma, or whether it be from social, emotional, cultural, spiritual trauma of suicide of a partner, of a father, of a child. Studies show that in being listened to and telling their stories, people whose lives have been scarred by mental illness gain restoration of self-worth, validation, confidence, autonomy and self-trust. They begin to exercise control over their lives as they determine for themselves how to improve their situation through the telling of their stories. In the same way, those scarred by suicide begin to heal through the telling of their stories and of their loved ones' stories. Whānau must therefore be facilitated to tell their own stories. I don't know how I'm going for time. I might skip this. No, I'll do it. In 2009-2010, as part of my postdoc study, I was fortunate enough to spend some time in a number of Indigenous communities in Aussie and Northern America, talking to them and listening to them about their understandings of Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. When I was in Alice Springs, I was introduced to this suicide prevention program called the Life Promotion Program. I've spoken about this before, so you may have heard me talk about it. Basically, it's a training package, and it's called Suicide Story. Essentially, Suicide Story was designed to get Aboriginal people talking about suicide. It's based on the ideas behind gatekeeping training, or suicide first aid intervention, which is a type of training that provides skills to intervene when someone's at immediate risk of suicide. So people are trained to notice and to then stop them at the gate. Suicide Story recognises that the people who have the relationships are those both best placed to notice changes in behaviour and best placed to gain the trust of a suicidal person. So therefore, best placed to intervene before a suicide occurs. Suicide Story involved listening to the stories of Aboriginal people and placing the issue of Aboriginal suicide in their worlds. It's about getting the conversations happening, giving people permission to talk, and giving people better tools to know how to handle suicidal behaviour in their whānau and communities. What impressed me when I heard about it was that it was developed with and for Indigenous peoples to help with their understanding about Aboriginal suicide and what they could do to respond to both serious concerns and common threats. Importantly, it also employed Aboriginal people to help deliver the training. The program built on Indigenous storytelling as a tool for Aboriginal suicide prevention. I had the privilege of hearing a couple of these people's stories at a hui in Alice Springs, and they were undoubtedly powerful. The same way that storytelling is recognised for its healing potential with Indigenous communities harmed by trauma, so was it here being used to prevent further trauma. This kind of Indigenous approach is what I would love to see being built more on in Aotearoa. Many Māori researchers believe what is really needed to impact Māori suicides is a paradigm shift. We need to completely change the way we are looking at suicide by privileging Māori worldviews, knowledges and values. Kiri Lawson Te Aho tells us that we need to whakamana our own processes because that will drive a change in the way we design interventions, the way we think about Māori suicide prevention, and the way our strategies are framed. A key component of the centering of Māori values is the recognition that at the core of Māori is whānau. We recognise that, and the government recognises that, apparently, in whānau order policies. So by privileging our worldview, by placing Māori fair and square in the middle of what suicide is, maybe we can change the way we think about Māori suicide prevention. I think that all our interventions, our preventions, our post-preventions need to be pitched at a whānau level. So we need to be upfront and real about the impact that this horror is having on our whānau. Maybe instead of counting the 105 Māori who ended their own lives last year as individuals then, perhaps we should be naming the loss by hapu and iwi. For many Māori that would be much more meaningful. Perhaps our statistics should also be more relevant, because in the last 6 years, 31 tamariki Māori under the age of 15 years and 147 rangatahi Māori, aged between 15 and 19, were lost from our whānau due to suicide. Where did those 178 tamariki and rangatahi whakapapa to? Where were they buried? And what about the 185 Māori aged in their 20s who suicided? How many parents, koro and kuia, buried their children in moko in the last 6 years? What about their brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, cousins of the 117 Māori aged in their 30s, the 83 aged in their 40s and the 48 aged in their 50s? And how many moko had to bury the 14 kaumātua aged 60 and over who took their lives by suicide in the last 6 years? We can count all those suicides as equaling 625, or we can look at the reality of Māori suicide through a Māori lens as not about the numbers. It's about the continual tangi, around 9 a month, that we endure. It's the loss of generational knowledge. It's the thousands of whānau whose lives are changed forever by suicide, because suicide is not just an act of individuality, it has a collective impact. That's our worldview. It's possible, maybe, that by reporting these deaths differently, in a whānau relevant way, maybe the effect will be understood differently. Maybe it will deter suicide. If people could see how utterly bereft and devastated suicide leaves those most important to them, and how damaging it is, would it make a difference? A few years back, I spent some time talking in depth with a respected kuia about her whānau's response to the attempted suicide of a young woman in her whānau. How her whānau responded was, a hui was called, and everybody was to speak, everybody spoke. The kuia asked every person present to tell the young woman who'd wanted her life ended what it would have been like for them had she succeeded. One by one, as painful as it was for that rangatahi, they did so. One of the younger women, I think it might have been a younger sister, I'm not sure, talked about, she said if she had died, she wouldn't have had someone to get hand-me-down clothes from. Now we can laugh at that, but the point made by this taina was that her tuakana line would have been broken. That kuia's response was what pitching out interventions at a whānau level looks like. Is also, I think, what privileging our worldviews, knowledges and values and processes looks like. But not all of us are that culturally, spiritually or even emotionally resourced enough to be able to respond in that way. So we definitely need support. I mean, years ago I found myself in the same situation where someone I loved dearly tried to end their life, and I would like to have been able to respond in the same way that kuia did. I would have liked those to whom she was precious to have been able to tell her how much she was needed, how much she was treasured, and how devastated we would have been had she succeeded. But I couldn't find the inner strength at that time to be able to exercise the rangatiratanga like that for my whānau. I think it's something, though, that I think it's those kind of strategies that we can be building on. So I think there are a number of other important take related to the kaupapa of suicide that need much more attention for the sake of preventing further deaths, particularly preventing further Māori deaths. One I've kind of spoken about is whakamā and its impact, particularly on our young people. Its traditional meanings and intent, and its link with suicide now. Another is related to how we teach our young men, in particular, to deal with the emotions of rejection. And the other is the legacy we leave behind. Personally, I'd love to see research focused on all these areas that could facilitate the discussions that need to be started. I'm a bit reluctant to say this part, but I promised a whānau member I would. When I told my whānau I was going to talk at this, one of them asked me if I could bring to the attention the importance of educating our police force and working differently with our whānau, because in half of the suicides in our family there's been police intervention in the weeks before, and I think there's definitely room for improvement in police interaction with Māori whānau, particularly those with mental illness. And I've probably just thrown up more questions and answers for you today, and I thought I'd end on one of these discussion topics. When you die, what is the legacy you want to leave behind? What do you want to imprint on the souls of your uri, your descendants, if you have any? What do you want to be remembered for? Because in that slide that I showed earlier, in the first generation of suicides, my auntie, she died 37 years ago now. She was an awesome woman. She was funny, she was beautiful, she was affectionate, she was always in trouble. And even now when we talk about her, we always laugh. We always have, she's the name that's raised around a few drinks. The thing that we always say is, I wish she was here. Wouldn't it be good if she was here? But is it really her laughter, her kisses, her cuddles that we remember first when she comes to mind? Because for me the answer is no. The first thing I think of, I remember her suicide. My husband too was an amazing man. He was the pautoka manawa of our whānau. He was my children's primary caregiver. He was our cook, our cleaner, the most domesticated man I ever met. He was fiercely proud of his children. He was fiercely proud of his whānau. He was fiercely proud of who he was, tautanga mahaki, rong whakātanga i te manuhiri. He could make the most beautiful cheesecakes and the yummiest mousse. He was an amazing DIYer. He wallpapered so many of my friends' houses I lost count. He was a builder, he was a painter, he was so capable. He was a fantastic provider, and he was the best boss anyone could ever ask for, because he fed his staff like you wouldn't believe. But are those the things that I remember when I think of him? Nope. The first thing I think is he suicided. His life forever now will be remembered by his death. And is that the legacy he wanted to leave? No. He would have wanted to be remembered for his love, his laughter, and for his life. But that's what suicide does. It changes your legacy. Those are the messages we need to kōrero about amongst our whānau. Those are the ones we need to be brave enough to kōrero about amongst our whānau. Because that little boy that I showed you at the beginning, Te Kaitiaki, he deserved to have his kōrero. To teach him all he needed to pass on. He deserved to know who he was from his kōrero. He deserved to learn his place on the marae from his kōrero. And our children deserve the same. So the loss of suicide from that perspective is immeasurable. That's all I've got to say. I hope that somewhere in my kōrero there's something useful. Kia ora.